In February 1991, the world's fourth largest army was dismantled in exactly 100 hours of ground combat. Saddam Hussein had spent decades building a heavily fortified million-man force, only to watch it evaporate under a new kind of technological pressure. This chart displays the primary catalyst for the conflict: debt. By 1990, Iraq owed foreign creditors $80 billion following its war with Iran. Low oil prices meant Baghdad could no longer sustain its military spending, which consumed 40% of the national GDP. Saddam Hussein looked to his neighbor, Kuwait, to solve his financial crisis. He demanded that Kuwait cancel $10 billion of Iraqi debt and provide immediate cash compensation, claiming Iraq's military had protected the Gulf from radical Islam. When Kuwait refused, Hussein turned to a military solution. On August 2, 1990, Iraqi armored divisions and helicopter-borne commandos seized Kuwait City in a surprise attack. Within 48 hours, Iraq fully occupied the country, seizing $2 billion from the Kuwaiti central bank and doubling its own oil reserves overnight. Hussein believed that a massive standing army provided a guarantee of invincibility. This reliance on sheer numbers blinded him to a shift in modern warfare, one where troop mass was about to be neutralized by precision technology. The invasion triggered an immediate, unanimous global backlash. By disrupting the balance of Middle Eastern oil production, Iraq had put the national incomes of nearly every industrialized nation at risk. The crisis even united traditional Cold War rivals. In Moscow, Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev broke with his former ally, informing Hussein that the Soviet Union would not support the invasion. To protect remaining regional oil supplies, the United States launched Operation Desert Shield. At the direction of President George H.W. Bush, American airborne and Air Force units began arriving in Saudi Arabia to deter a further Iraqi aggression. By seizing Kuwait, Hussein had accidentally catalyzed the assembly of a massive 42-nation coalition. He was no longer facing a regional neighbor, but the most technologically advanced military force ever organized. Before a single shot was fired, the coalition launched a 24/7 logistical operation to sustain its buildup in the Saudi desert. Modern warfare is determined by the supply chain long before the first tank moves. This image shows a fraction of the hardware arriving at Saudi ports. Within 90 days, the U.S. alone shipped medical equipment, uniforms, and food for 157,000 troops. To keep the vehicles and aircraft operational, the coalition consumed 75 million liters of fuel every single day. While the coalition built a mobile supply machine, Hussein's strategy remained static. He dug 10 divisions into deep defensive lines across Kuwait, utilizing minefields, artillery choke points, and trenches filled with oil to be ignited during an attack. This logistical superiority was the strict prerequisite for the conflict. The coalition didn't just bring soldiers, they built an unstoppable industrial machine in the desert that could sustain a high-intensity offensive indefinitely. On January 17, 1991, the defensive phase ended. The coalition launched Desert Storm with an overwhelming aerial bombardment targeting Baghdad and Iraqi military installations. The coalition utilized the F-117 Nighthawk, a stealth jet designed with flat, angled surfaces to deflect radar waves. These aircraft systematically dismantled Iraqi radar bunkers and command centers without being detected, rendering Iraq's anti-air defenses useless. Within 3 days, the coalition secured total air supremacy. By targeting command and control centers first, they effectively blinded the Iraqi military, leaving frontline divisions isolated and unable to receive orders from Baghdad. On February 24, the ground war began with this left hook maneuver. While some units pushed directly into Kuwait, the main coalition force swept hundreds of kilometers through the open desert to the west, outflanking the static Iraqi defenses. As they retreated, Iraqi forces ignited hundreds of oil wells. The resulting smoke was so thick it darkened the sky at noon, creating a zero-visibility environment that Hussein hoped would neutralize the coalition's air and ground advantages. This schematic explains why that visibility gap failed to stop the coalition. The M1A1 Abrams utilized thermal imaging, sensors that detect infrared heat signatures rather than visible light. While Iraqi T-72 crews were blinded by the smoke, the Abrams could see the heat from Iraqi engines perfectly. Thermal imaging turned the oil smoke into an advantage for the coalition. American crews could identify and target Iraqi armor from kilometers away, firing on targets that were completely unaware they were being tracked. The Abrams also employed gyroscopic stabilization, a system of internal sensors and motors that keeps the main gun level regardless of the tank's movement. This allowed coalition crews to fire accurately while moving at 40 miles per hour, whereas Iraqi tanks had to stop to aim. The technical mismatch was absolute. In a single engagement, 13 Abrams tanks destroyed 35 Iraqi tanks in just 90 seconds. The coalition was firing faster, from further away, and with near-perfect accuracy while on the move. The combination of thermal optics and mobile firing turned the battle into a one-sided engagement. Hussein's numerical advantage was irrelevant when his tanks were being destroyed before they could even locate the enemy. The Iraqi front line collapsed within hours. Demoralized by weeks of bombardment and facing an enemy they couldn't see, thousands of Iraqi conscripts deserted or surrendered en masse as airborne units cut off their retreat. This is the highway of death, where coalition air power trapped Iraqi forces attempting to flee Kuwait City. Hundreds of military and stolen civilian vehicles were destroyed in a single bottleneck, marking the total disintegration of the Iraqi retreat. The final tally confirms the lopsided nature of the war. Iraq lost over 1,300 tanks and suffered tens of thousands of casualties. The coalition lost 292 personnel, though notably nearly half of those losses were the result of accidents or friendly fire. Desert Storm demonstrated that sheer troop mass and static fortifications were no longer viable against precision, mobile technology. In 100 hours, the world's fourth largest army had been effectively erased. On February 28, 1991, President Bush declared a ceasefire. Kuwait was liberated, and the military objectives of the coalition were met exactly 100 hours after the ground campaign began. However, the military victory did not lead to a change in leadership. Saddam Hussein remained in power and immediately used his surviving helicopter gunships, which were permitted under the ceasefire, to violently suppress internal uprisings in northern and southern Iraq. This left the Iraqi regime intact, creating a complex regional instability that would persist for decades. The coalition had achieved its goal of liberation, but the underlying geopolitical issues that sparked the invasion remained unresolved. Desert Storm proved that a military can achieve absolute technical dominance in a matter of days, yet still leave a region's deepest geopolitical fractures untouched. The 100-hour war was a demonstration of technological mastery, but also a reminder of the limits of military power alone. By January 1991, Iraqi President Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait and positioned his forces for a massive confrontation. The threat he posed was immense. Iraq fielded a 1 million-man military, the fourth largest in the world, and 10 of those divisions were now heavily dug into the Kuwaiti desert. They built a layered wall in the sand. This meant miles of tall dirt berms, deep trenches filled with raw oil, dense minefields, and artillery pre-sighted to hit any natural choke point. Saddam Hussein's strategy was calculated. He intended to force the US-led coalition into a grinding war of attrition, transporting the lessons of the Vietnam conflict to the open desert. The logic was straightforward: inflict massive casualties on the advancing forces, and casualty-averse Western nations would quickly lose the political will to keep fighting. That left the coalition with a dilemma. They had to figure out how to dislodge a fortified 1 million-man army without sending thousands of their own troops into a catastrophic meat grinder. The coalition's solution was to take the fight off the ground entirely. At 3 a.m. on January 17, 1991, they launched a massive campaign to seize absolute control of the sky. The first move was to blind the enemy. Apache attack helicopters flew low to the ground to hunt and destroy Iraqi early warning radar installations. With the radars down, F-117 stealth jets, aircraft designed with sharp, angular surfaces specifically to deflect radar waves, slipped right past the remaining defenses to strike command centers deep inside Baghdad. The Iraqi response was chaotic. Without radar guidance, they fired surface-to-air missiles and thousands of anti-aircraft rounds blindly into the night sky, hoping one would hit a target. The coalition organized the airspace above the battlefield, dividing southern Iraq and Kuwait into grid sections called kill boxes. Within these boundaries, the bombing was relentless, systematically destroying over 1,100 Iraqi artillery pieces from above. Before a single coalition soldier even crossed the border, the massive Iraqi front line had been rendered deaf, blind, and functionally paralyzed. When the ground invasion finally launched on February 24th, coalition troops advanced toward a severely weakened and highly demoralized enemy. To deal with the remaining physical fortifications, coalition tanks physically dismantled the battlefield. Using large bulldozer blades mounted to their armor, they smashed right through the sandberms and plowed tons of earth directly into the Iraqi trenches. Iraqi forces ignited trenches filled with raw oil, creating thick, choking black smoke to blind incoming troops. But the U.S. M1A1 Abrams tanks utilized a major technological countermeasure: thermal optics. These specialized cameras detect heat instead of light, allowing crews to hunt Iraqi armor straight through the pitch-black smoke. Iraqi tanks, relying on older, conventional optical systems without thermal capabilities, were essentially fighting blind in the dark clouds. Paired with stabilized gun barrels that let coalition crews fire accurately while moving at top speed, superior visibility turned Saddam's static defenses into a deadly trap. Coalition armor won engagements with near impunity. On the strategic map, the coalition bypassed the main defenses with a massive left hook. This armored maneuver swept west, encircling the Iraqi army. This succeeded because coalition air power kept Iraqi forces pinned down. They couldn't reposition without being destroyed from above. The Iraqi army collapsed. Faced with encirclement and brutal air attacks, tens of thousands deserted, mounting a chaotic retreat toward Baghdad. As hundreds of stolen cars and military vehicles clogged the main highway out of Kuwait City, coalition aircraft trapped the retreating column, bombing it into a twisted wreckage that became known as the Highway of Death. Thanks to weeks of meticulous preparation from the sky, the actual ground combat was remarkably short. The coalition achieved total military victory in exactly 100 hours. Operation Desert Storm proved that technologically advanced air superiority can completely neutralize a massive fortified army before the primary battle even begins. As the Iraqi army retreated from Kuwait, they found themselves completely bottlenecked. Hundreds of stolen cars and military vehicles clogged Highway 8, trapping soldiers and supplies on a single desert road. Coalition aircraft took immediate advantage of the traffic jam. They continuously strafed and bombed the panicked column, turning the retreat route into twisted metal. On the ground, the technological mismatch was absolute. With their 120mm main guns, depleted uranium rounds, and thermal vision, American M1A1 Abrams tanks easily cut through the battlefield smoke, plowing past the wreckage of older, outmatched Iraqi armor. Exactly 100 hours after ground operations commenced, the coalition forces achieved their military objective. Kuwait was liberated. The rapid conventional fighting was over. But the sudden halt to the violence left a massive power vacuum in its wake, instantly triggering a severe humanitarian crisis across the region. On February 28, 1991, President George H.W. Bush announced that at midnight, all U.S. and coalition forces would suspend their offensive combat operations, freezing their troops in place. They left behind an Iraqi military in total ruins. 24 Iraqi divisions had been defeated, and as many as 175,000 demoralized troops were surrendering to coalition forces. The coalition suffered fewer than 300 fatalities, while the Iraqi military saw tens of thousands killed and over 75,000 wounded. But these military figures obscure the massive civilian toll. Hundreds of thousands were already displaced, vastly outnumbering the combat casualties. By halting their advance, the coalition forces left a fractured but surviving dictatorial regime to rule over a destroyed country, setting off a chain reaction for the people still living there. As Iraqi troops retreated from Kuwait, they executed a scorched earth policy. They set demolition charges on hundreds of Kuwaiti oil wells to cripple the nation's economic lifeblood. The resulting fires caused massive pollution, pumping so much thick black smoke into the atmosphere that the sky went dark even during the day. Escaping the violence and the toxic air, Hundreds of thousands of people packed whatever they could carry and fled across rough terrain to find safety. This massive influx of refugees poured into neighboring countries like Jordan and Saudi Arabia, severely straining local resources and spreading the conflict's instability across international borders. A military operation defined by precise strikes had produced a sprawling, borderless environmental and refugee crisis that the victorious nations were not equipped to handle. The physical damage of the war wasn't limited to the Middle East. It followed the coalition troops back home. Thousands of victorious veterans began suffering from Gulf War syndrome, a condition marked by chronic fatigue and severe, unexplained neurological and physical ailments. The exact cause remains highly debated. Theories point to the inhalation of the oil well smoke, exposure to depleted uranium rounds, or contact with nerve agents released when coalition bombs destroyed Iraqi chemical facilities. Up to 250,000 U.S. veterans reported these debilitating symptoms. That is more than a third of the entire combat force deployed. This ongoing health crisis proved that the fallout of Desert Storm extended far past the official ceasefire, leaving a toxic legacy for the soldiers who fought it. Inside Iraq, previously repressed groups sensed an opportunity. The Shiite majority in the south and Kurdish militias in the north mobilized to overthrow a severely weakened Saddam Hussein. The U.S. government actively encouraged these civilian and rebel groups. Radio broadcasts from the Voice of America explicitly urged the Iraqi people to rise up and take control. But when revolts broke out in 14 of Iraq's 18 provinces, the coalition refused to intervene. They strictly adhered to their UN mandate of liberating Kuwait, actively avoiding a messy regime change. This map shows the geopolitical calculus behind that decision. Western powers preferred keeping an intact Iraq as a territorial buffer to keep their arch-enemy, Iran, in check, rather than seeing the country fracture. Eventually, the coalition offered minimal half measures. They dropped humanitarian aid and established northern and southern no-fly zones, restricted airspace where Iraqi jets were forbidden to operate. The coalition possessed the absolute military might to protect these rebelling populations. Instead, they chose deliberate political inaction to maintain the region's balance of power. Left unchecked, Saddam Hussein launched a swift, violent crackdown against the fragmented and poorly supplied revolutionary groups. He deployed his fiercely loyal Republican Guard, an elite, well-armed military faction, using their surviving heavy armor to systematically crush the rebellions city by city. A specific loophole in the ceasefire agreement permitted Iraq to continue operating military helicopters. The regime immediately used these gunships to suppress the lightly armed rebels and gun down fleeing civilians. Up to 180,000 civilians and rebels were killed by state violence or starvation, all while heavily armed coalition troops watched from just across the border. Desert Storm achieved its stated objective with striking military efficiency. Yet its politically calculated conclusion left a tyrant fully empowered and the region deeply scarred, laying the groundwork for decades of future bloodshed.